Just proof that nothing is ever simple. Got this throttle cable, trying to get hooked up. Of course it says it fits an LT, and then the one that shows up says it's for an LS. And of course the little round barrel that I expected to fit inside the throttle body catch is too big a diameter, so I'm gonna have to cut this down on the lathe so I can get to fit in there nice, and then at least it set screws from the end. Should be able to make that work without too much issue. But then on the other side, we really have no way of properly attaching this to anything, so I need to like sandwich this into the firewall. Makes the most sense. Of course, it's all curved surface back there, so with a little bit of hammer massaging of the firewall, I got a flat enough surface now to actually bolt the thing in, and then of course I'm going to have to trim it shorter and all of that. So the next thing will be I have to modify this little barrel on the front, and this is meant to be the attachment to the pedal. However, this is not the style that the pedal in this car is, so I'm actually going to modify this piece in order to fit in there. This one's meant to have like the plastic that kind of springs in and then it catches with just the ball that's on the end of the cable. This one, it just catches in this aluminum piece, but I can cut down the barrel of this aluminum piece so that's a tight fit into the pedal. That way it should stay retained and not fall out. Well, I felt like I was finally, making progress towards the end of this project. Just the wiring mostly left and some other things. Well, that situation has gone south in a hurry. Now we're at the stage where I need to not only get the electrical stuff in, but I have to get all the other electrical stuff out. So now I'm pulling the whole interior, like seats. I'm in the process of getting the carpet out. I still got to get the passenger seat. I had to climb across, get the other door open, because we didn't have any electrical power to that. And it's a good thing too that I just did it that way, because otherwise I would have been looking at completely the wrong wires trying to jump and would have wasted a bunch of time. But now with having the engine wiring, I got to change all these different sensors because they're not compatible with the wiring harness that I didn't know about until. So we got to change things like an air temp sensor, coolant temp sensor. We got to change the coil. We got to change the oxygen sensors. We got to put a MAF on the engine. What else was there? I feel like there was more yet. But then, and then we got to add extensions for a couple of those too, because the harness, was set up for the other side, which was weird and a thing. But that's going to need to be done. But in order to move on from that, plug everything in, and then start putting all the cooling hoses and everything in, to start putting the radiator and all that stuff in the engine bay, I need to be able to run that wiring harness through the firewall from the interior. But before I can get started on any of that, the highest thing up here underneath the dash is window wipers. All it's got is the old vacuum operated wiper motor, which we're going to switch that over to an electric one. But we don't have arms, so I got to wait for the electric one to come in. I'm going to have to make arms in order to operate them. We're still going to have to get the rest of the window wiper arm stuff later, but that's not that we're worried about. But once those are in, then I need to figure out where I'm relocating the aftermarket heater box to, because where it was mounted at was not a good location. It's going to most likely be in the way of a bunch of other things, and it wasn't hooked up properly anyway, because there was some vacuum valves and stuff to operate it that lines were clipped, it wasn't even hooked up right. And once we deal with that, then I can actually have the wires pass through for the engine and then figure out where I'm putting the computer. I finally found the little computer box for the remotes. That was up under the dash, but that's going to have to get moved based on where some of this other stuff ends up. And I still got to put the brake booster and a new brake pedal in, and that's all got to mount to the firewall under the dash. It means our box for the digital dash is going to have to move because of which panel that's mounted to. It's going to be too close to the brake booster. And all of this stuff now is like, there's all these other things, and now I gotta sit and wait for this window wiper thing to show up because that's the first thing that's gotta go in. But in the meantime, we're gonna finish pulling the interior out. Hopefully we'll be able to start maybe trying to lay out some of the wiring, maybe at least get the hole drilled for all of the wiring going to the engine. Maybe I can find a way to keep that looped up and out of the way. In the meantime, I can certainly work on the brake pedal and booster. But yeah, I don't know, it feels like, all of a sudden there's a whole bunch more stuff again. Moving the brake booster up onto the firewall here. It was very flexible. I needed to reinforce it. You see the plate I put in here as reinforcement. It's kind of an odd shape, but I needed to get around these other panels that bolt on, and I wanted to cover up a few extra holes that had been around here. So we still got the panel to go back on around the steering shaft and the cover for up here. We'll be able to bolt it through. This is now very rigid, so it should be a good reinforcement for moving that up onto the firewall. This is a brake pedal and bracket. This is just one of the cheaper brake pedals I found on Summit. It's actually for like an early Mustang. The bracket I made is just to get it to bolt on to the back side of the firewall there. We got our pivot point here. I had to pull this pin because the Ford one was bigger and machine it down and then put it back in to match up with the Corvette booster. It'll be just slightly forward of the pivot point, so as you step on the pedal it should keep it nice and level as far as compressing the master cylinder, and it clears your steering shaft pretty nice. I don't know if this is going to quite be enough. It should be, however I want to get it bolted up and tested out first, because if I need to reinforce this anymore, either up to a higher point on the firewall or to maybe the lower part of the dash, then I'll be able to do that before painting it. At this point, I kind of have no choice other than to kind of skip ahead on a lot of stuff and not show it on camera. There's just so much going on under the dash right now, but I don't want to just haphazardly like it was before. Plus, with just getting everything stripped away, I started pulling the old insulation out because it was just rotted and kind of just in the way and making it dusty everywhere. I've got Dynamat to put in it, but then it's like, holy crap, is there a lot of holes in the firewall. So I just got done patching up a few holes in the firewall. The larger ones anyway, the Dynamat will seal off a lot of the smaller ones, and I'm still going to need like 50% of them anyway for pass-throughs on some wiring or just bolt holes that they're ones that I drilled to make a mount for like the coolant tank and that kind of stuff. And it's just so many things trying to happen in one place, and the last thing I want to do is rush the wiring on this. And looking at me on the camera with my, laying on my back and my hands up under the dash ain't gonna be worth the crap to watch anyway. So we're gonna skip through a lot of this stuff. We'll just hit the highlights and come along for the journey. Alright, getting a few projects done today. These are my new wiper linkage arms to go up under the dash because we weren't able to find the originals. I am taking the extra step of making these heims work a little nicer. They're actually just something I had around, and the rod I had around too, so I was able to cut the threads on the lathe, screw these on. But I got this little brass bushing or bronze bushing on there. Now that's in order to fit in the arm without having slop, because while I could have just shoved the bolt in and tighten it down, if it comes slightly loose over time or just it working back and forth, it might start to slide within the larger hole that's in the arm. I didn't want that, so I made these little spacers to take up that slack. The holes on the flat bar actually are the same as what's on the wiper motor. I don't think that's anything fancy other than they got some plastic washers that came with the kit. I might be able to fit those on there and then they just retain with a snap ring. If that's the case, I might just have to trim these down a little bit thinner, and then I can use those too and make sure we're eliminating quite a bit of wear. Also, just got done taking a large portion of this harness and stripped it back so that I could move my ignition coil plugs and the MAF to the opposite side of the engine, because I ordered this. I specifically stated that it was a Corvette accessory drive, and everything's mirrored basically from the Camaro and Fleetwood setup and Caprice and all that stuff. So it should have been that way. Anyway, instead, the only thing apart the Corvette that they got right was that they added length to the alternator plug so that it will reach from the passenger side to the driver's side, even though the alternator's on the driver's side. So, like, I don't know, in my mind, the alternator should have just been wired on the correct side, as well as the fact that the ignition coil and MAF should have been on that side also, because even with the Corvette fitment and then using the Camaro elbow style, if I try to send that to the driver's side, it just hits the alternator. So obviously there's no way that could possibly be installed correctly. So all that stuff, and then the actual mount for the coil is on the passenger side, and on the Camaro it's on the driver's side. So like all that stuff automatically should have been on the other side. So I'm a little upset about that, because I'm, had to screw around and take the time to rewire this to the correct side of the engine harness. Now, when I called and complained about it, they did send me extension wires in order to move that, but even though I asked, and even on the paperwork it said that the MAF needed to move as well, I only got the kit for the ignition. So at that point I'm like, screw it, I'll just repin the whole thing. Then I'm not even putting any butt connectors in here and extending that harness. It's just the right way how it should have been. Explain to me why this seems to always happen is you buy a specific wiring harness for a specific engine. It's supposed to have all the stuff exactly how you need it, and then you gotta end up pulling the loom apart to add 2 inches to a lead. I've got the starter and the knock sensor, and the knock sensor is pulled pretty much straight tight to hook up coming off of the whole main harness up here. But I literally have to shove the main harness as far down onto the transmission as I can to even get it to have a little bit of slack, at which point it has the entire injectors along the passenger side of the engine pulled tight to the back. Like, what would have been the harm in an extra 2 or 3 inches of slack on that, where knowing you got to route it around the engine and the exhaust manifolds and whatever else is on that side of the engine. And instead I'm here cutting it back apart, so I'm into this harness for the second time. Let's just say I'm less than thrilled about the requirement of needing to do this in order to make it right. And while I was down there and looking at hooking up the starter, it hit me that, oh yeah, still gonna have to run a ignition trigger wire down there. That'll have to come from the harness that's gonna wire the rest of the car, which, yeah, okay, that didn't need to be on this, you know, ECU harness. However, it's the only wire that's gotta run down there by itself like that. Why wouldn't you just include the wire and have it pop out under the dash so it's an easier hookup? Like, shit. You know, for the price I paid, I would have expected this to be a little better thought out. But here we are, and this is part of the joys of wiring a vehicle. And you know, it takes a lot of wires and a lot of thinking that maybe did or didn't get covered when it should have. I've also got the temp sensors for the dash that I'm going to have to run yet another harness out here through the dash onto, because the hookup that came with this wiring harness for the factory ECU doesn't include outputs. I'd think that there had to have been some for the factory dash, although it could have been CAN bus, in which case that isn't going to plan out for us anyway. But at the same time, it's like, shit, talk about trying to make a whole bunch of extra work out of something that didn't have to be. But here we are. So what did I gain for my effort? I now have enough room on the bottom, and actually I went more than just the 2-3 inches I was talking about. I went almost 6, because actually there's still the factory loom connectors down there that can like just bite onto this corrugated stuff. So I might as well run it through those two down there, because it'll hold it nice and out of the way to the oil pan and behind the starter. I've also been able to add these little P-clips underneath the studs that hold the factory plastics on top, and that's the way the factory harness was held. And down here for the OptiSpark connector, I had to kind of destroy the old one to get it, but now I've got that bolt right there that'll hold that clip on just like it's supposed to, so that this isn't flopping everywhere and it's held in just like factory. These two for the coolant temp sensor and for the alternator plug kind of annoy me because they have to come across the front of the engine. I added the P-clip here with just a bolt, because there's these two ears that they're just an open hole on the front of this water pump, so that's kind of handy. Hopefully this is out of the way enough that the electric fans will clear, otherwise I'll have to switch the fans around to the front side of the radiator, and hopefully everything clears with the grill assembly, but hopefully it'll just clear and we can avoid that altogether. This last little plug here is for my MAF sensor. Everything else is plugged in. I had to order a few more P-clips in order to bolt down the passenger side, just like I did the driver's side, make sure that harness is held in place and not going to be pushed and pulled and vibrating and rattling around and everything all the time. Got our radiator hoses hooked up, or rather the heater core hoses. We'll be able to hook them back in with the Corvette tank and get that mounted over here. Probably going to have to build a couple of brackets off the fender just to hold the hoses a little bit nicer. But I'm not going to put that on yet because I still got to worry about getting the PCM mounted to the firewall on the backside. I'm sure putting a plug for those two buttons is overkill and looming it, but at least them clips were there on the back of the factory dash to just kind of hook it in there. And I want to do the plug because I'm tying the two grounds together, and I want to actually run a wire for that, and then the other two are just trigger wires that need to go into the gauge cluster computer. And this is just going to be a lot better setup than what was on there before. As you can see, we've gone to some nice like stainless style buttons versus these are what was in there before, and you know, it's just taped together wires, and there's just these plastic ones, and they had to have a washer on them and stuff because they didn't even fit in the hole properly. At least these ones fit in the hole properly too. I've just spent the better part of an hour messing around with the defrost vents. This one was on tight over here, but the driver's side one was flopping around. It would have been an annoying rattle at the least, on top of the fact that it wouldn't have functioned because it wouldn't have been able to push any air up into the defrost area. Now I'm over to the passenger side here, and this one's got a little hose extension on it up underneath the dash. But with these corrugated hoses, there's really not anything to clamp against. So now I've made this spacer bushing basically out of some Delrin that will push up inside of that hose so that we have something solid to hose clamp against to make sure that these don't fall off. Normally these push on and then they can be held on with zip tie, but there needs to be some kind of a bump for it to actually retain it. That is not the case with the piece of hose that's up on here. I'm guessing that it's probably a factory type hose thing. The driver's side didn't have one, but the driver's side did have a bump up in there. So that one once I finally got this hose to fit over the one on the driver's side, I was able to zip tie that one and it's nice and tight, but we had to do something different on the passenger side here. And this is just stuff that you don't think about that's going to eat up time in a project because, I mean, I want to wire this car and all of this other stuff keeps coming up that needs to be done before I can mount the computer and start mounting the fuse box and running wires, and it's all this other stuff that's up under the dash that I have to think about ahead of time. At this point, I'm quickly approaching the point of no return when it comes to the wiring, and I'm doing everything I can to not cut wires yet. I've already got most of the accessory things that I need to get mounted under the dash on the passenger side. That includes the PCM for the engine, 4 additional relays. Still need to put in the remote for the door releases. And I got the heating controls, and the wiring for the window wipers is up under the dash yet. All of that stuff is kind of collected on that side of the car. The real last hurdle I have is mounting the fuse box. Just trying to figure out what my best option is here right now. I think mounting it vertically so it sits under the dash orientated like this is going to work best, so that when you pull the cover off, you spin around and look at it, it makes sense and it's not upside down. I should be able to tuck it up underneath the dash so that it can't be seen. However, I've had to undo a whole bunch of the coils because wiring is actually quite heavy, and there's just no way I was going to be able to hold it up there and then have all these coils just hanging off of it and getting in the way kind of thing. So I had to kind of unravel everything. But while I'm doing that, I'm looking at what all of these labeled wires are, just to be aware of it, because if I come across something that I'm not going to use, I might want to just pull that wire back through the harness and leave it looped up underneath the dash. I don't want to disconnect it completely and strip it out of the whole harness, just in case we can use it for something else. A good case in point is there are 2 wires on this fuse box for a power antenna. There's the constant power supply, and then there's the key switched that would make the power antenna go up. This car doesn't have a power antenna, but I can use both of those wires to supply power to our remote door locks. And that's just something I'll have to make a note of. Also, with the way these suicide doors are set up and the shaved door handles, everything has to work as far as that door lock is concerned. So I'm going to have it set up in a way that I'm utilizing my extra relays, so that instead of using the relays built into the remote box and then having to splice in more heavy gauge wires, and I just want to avoid as much wiring as possible on this. So what I'm going to do is the remote relays will just be a trigger for the remote. where they plug in will be spliced in with the release buttons for the driver and passenger side doors for when you're sitting in the car. And on the driver's side door, in addition, I'll have a remote safety, like, you know, if the battery died and you can get to the battery and change it out, or the remotes die, you have another way to trigger an electrical signal to get the doors to open. Moment of truth here on the first set of wires. I got my steering column group, I got the stuff separated out that's going to different switches. These are the ones that are going to the steering column. I have the plug for it, and I want to keep it fairly short because it does come off of that steering column and reach all the way up to the firewall. So we're starting at the top of the firewall. I only need to go down like 6 inches, so we're gonna go about should be several inches extra at that point because I can get all the way down underneath the column, and I know the column wiring will come up the firewall a little bit. So here we go. And here we are. First connection done. I sent some different electrical tape with this. Decided to try it out versus the regular stuff I get. Something's different. Whether it's better or worse, I don't know. It's probably better. But now we got enough length here that I can add a clip up here on the firewall somewhere after I get everything else figured out. And then a little bit of tape around here, or this plastic, maybe I can get it tucked in there, but either way, it'll be well up out of the way of the pedals. I'm really trying to take my time and do my best with this wiring. So right now I have the fuse box wires coming in, I've got buttons coming in, I got sensors coming in, I have ECU outputs coming in, and got the tied in. I have the fuse box and ECU stuff tied together here just more or less as support, like nothing's actually crossing there, but some of the ECU wires go to this side, some go to this side, and I have 3 that come off of here that I added this plug to that I'll be able to tap into underneath the dash for the 3 wires out of the fuse panel side that need to go to this. It may not be the best, but it's definitely the better of the wiring jobs that I've done so far in my lifetime. And we're just gonna kind of keep trucking along on it. I'm starting to make notes in the ECU instructions and in the fuse box instructions to kind of be noting what goes where, so that if this inevitably ever has to get worked on at some point in time, it'll be a whole lot easier to chase down the wires when you know where they're actually going.